From this old school engine instrumentation to this, a modern engine analyzer certified to replace the original factory engine gauges. In this episode of the Avionics Upgrade series, we'll take a look at the JPI EDM 930 and how we installed it in my Bonanza.
Just starting to take the panel apart so I can start disassembling the pieces that are coming out.
My friend Gene, you remember him from the Avidyne installation video, performed the installation of the EDM 930 with help from his friend Mike. The way I understand it, installing an engine monitor isn't terribly complicated, but it is quite a bit of work because of the many probes and connections it takes for a complete system. And because fuel and oil lines are involved, everything has to be done just right to be safe. So having an extra person to help and cross-check the work was very helpful.
I made copies, so I'm just going to check off each item that I take out of the box and install.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have an empty hole in the panel over here that's the same size as the suction gauge. We're trying to clean this panel up as much as possible, so it was desired to move the suction gauge to this empty hole. The suction gauge is teed off of the gyro instruments on this side, so it's going to be very simple. We'll basically just pull it out, shorten the hose, and install it in the empty slot.
We're starting on a Friday evening and hope to complete the project over a few sessions, hopefully no later than the following weekend.
If anybody else was using just a wire clipper to remove things from my engine compartment, I'd get really nervous. But
I previously had an EDM 800, already a capable device which has many similar probes, like this exhaust gas temperature probe here in the exhaust stack, or the cylinder head temperature probe you see here below the spark plug. But for this installation of the EDM 930 as a primary engine instrument, all the old probes had to come out and be replaced with new ones.
There's the new unit with each probe.
oh yeah.
I'm just collecting up all the old wire ties.
While Mike is taking care of the probes, Gene is removing the old instruments from the engine cluster.
First casualty.
All right. Did it resist at all?
No.
Another consideration was electrical power to the EDM 930. I already had a circuit breaker for my old EDM 800, but that one was powered with the Avionics master switch. Since the EDM 930 is my only way of seeing fuel and oil pressure on startup, it needs to be powered up with the aircraft master switch, not the Avionics. Gene had a good solution for that.
Okay, this actually works out pretty well, because this is the last breaker in the line. So what I'll do is they use a flat piece of metal as a bus bar that runs across all the terminals on all of the breakers. So since it's the last one, it makes it easy because I can basically just cut that strip of metal so that the bus stops with that one. I'll make a jumper to run from this power terminal over to the main power bus to bypass the Avionics master.
Yeah.
So that actually works out very well. Won't be hard at all.
Alright, it's day 2 of our installation journey. Gene and Mike have been here for a few hours already, taking advantage of the cooler mornings. It's now 9:30. I'm here with some snacks for the crew. Let's see what they've done so far.
Morning.
Good morning, Gene. This sure looks different than what I remember from last night.
That's good, right?
Yeah. So I see you cut a big hole in the old panel.
I did.
And the overlay panel is going to be on top of that later.
Yep. These are still connected just so I don't lose the ends of the wires. This is your old indicator. That one I can probably just take out, but I'm going to need the wires off of your fuel indicator and the rest of these.
Sure.
The oil pressure used to have a line on the back of this, but it will actually be from a sending unit inside the forward of the firewall now. So
that was a hose
for
the oil pressure?
Yep, there was a rigid line, and it's over there in the box. So I just removed that from the firewall, and we'll remove the hose on the other side of that, and then add the sending unit in place of the old one.
Okay.
A word about the overlay panel. The Bonanza's instrument panel is part of the structure of the aircraft. One cannot just take the centerpiece out and replace it with something new. My options were to build a complete, all-new panel for the entire cockpit, or to cut a hole into the existing panel, large enough for the new JPI instrument, and then add a piece of metal over the existing panel to cover up the old one. That's called an overlay panel, and it's the route I took because it is much simpler than touching every single instrument, switch, and radio there is in the cockpit. Meanwhile, Mike has completed the installation of the temperature probes on the right side cylinders.
The cylinder head temperature probes and the exhaust gas temperature probes are installed on this side.
Awesome. Let's take a look. So the old ones are hanging out?
These are the old ones here. The 3 old ones. And this is the wires to the new probes.
So,
one more piece for the box.
all right.
There's more to the engine monitor besides temperatures.
And time for a
For
donut.
example,
Yeah.
a transducer measures the fuel flow very precisely. If you program the available fuel into the computer before a flight, it can then always show how much fuel is left in the tanks by subtracting the used fuel from the starting fuel. This is more accurate than most fuel gauges are.
This is the new fuel flow transducer,
Ah, yes.
and it comes supplied with the correct fittings. This is a direct replacement for the new unit, same size and same dimension. It came with a new fire sleeve, one piece, so instead of having a split sleeve, it will be one piece with steel clamps on each end. Make it fireproof.
The next step is the overlay panel.
So it looks like if we make it about 8.5 wide, it would cover up about perfectly and give us a little bit of gap, because we don't want it to touch either one of these.
Right.
Then it'll be
No,
it'll
because
look
the
odd
sub
then.
panel in particular is vibrating a little bit, moving a little bit,
Correct.
so you need a bit of a gap.
So we'll do 8.5 wide, and we'll do looks like 9.5 tall would be about perfect.
Okay.
So I've got a straightener too, so we can.
Starting with a sheet of aluminum and precise measurements of the desired size, Gene and Mike first cut a piece slightly larger than what's needed in the end, and then make smooth final cuts for the desired dimensions.
It's a shear, so it makes a nice, clean, straight cut all the way across it.
Then comes the not so easy task of making the cutout for the new EDM 930, which we want to flush mount from behind.
You're trying to make it the exact size of the cutout?
Yep. Mainly just so I can get it centered on the layout before I start making measurements, and then I'll actually make measurements before I score it. I just want to figure out, it's an easy way for me to get it centered and lay everything out before I actually destroy it.
While Gene is doing that, Mike is putting the new fuel transducer in place.
Is that the new transducer going in?
Yes, the transducer and the fire sleeve, and then the steel clamps for each end. Here's the clamping tool that
Oh, yes.
will eventually clamp when I pull this up over the steel clamp on both ends of the fire sleeve, which really is the finishing touch, so that no flame can get inside on the ends. And then
So that's already secured and...
yeah, it's all secured on there. This is the transducer inside, secured on this end. I just have to break the pigtail off, and then this is just slotted through here to get the wiring through. And that's the way it was instructed in the manual.
All right.
This is the completed connection now for the transducer.
Is it the same using the same mating connector from before?
No, this is all new connection. Before it had knife edge connectors.
Uh-huh.
So I just eliminated the knife edge from the aircraft side and put on new connections that came with the kit.
Okay, but the same wiring.
Looking at the connections, there's a lot of similarity between the connectors of the removed EDM 800 and the new EDM 930, which helps a lot with the installation and wiring. The EDM 930 basically has one new additional connector over the 800, used for all the new things which the 800 didn't have. This makes the wiring part of upgrading from an 800 to a 930 pretty easy. Meanwhile, Gene has made good progress on the overlay panel.
So we're trying to basically rough fit the overlay piece that will actually hold the unit in place. Obviously, the best way to do this would be a water jet or a laser cutting CNC machine. Out here in the real world, you know, not a major corporation, we don't have those kinds of things. So we have to do with hand tools. So what I did here is I started with a rectangle that was the size that we needed, and then using the manual, we made as precise of measurements as possible and scribed an outline of what we needed with the screw holes already in place. And then I basically just took a hole saw and started connecting them to get the large part of it out, and then cleaned it up with tin snips, and now I'm sanding and filing to make the edges hopefully perfect.
In the end, we all agree it would have been a better idea to order the metal piece for this overlay panel from a supplier who can make all the necessary cuts automatically with precise computer-controlled tools. We'll keep that in mind for next time. It's day 3 of the project, and Gene gives me a summary of what's coming up next.
So the old fuel flow was actually fuel pressure, so we didn't have an electronic fuel pressure sending unit, so we have to add that. So that's basically the only wire we're adding from in front of the firewall to underneath the panel. So we will have to thread a wire through the firewall and add a fuel pressure sending unit to what used to be the fuel pressure direct line to the gauge. So it actually the old system used to send fuel all the way into the instrument panel to the gauge.
To the mechanical gauge.
To the mechanical gauge, and that's how it measured fuel pressure, which it translated into fuel flow.
Right.
So the new system has an actual flow transducer for fuel flow, which is much more accurate. So it will actually have separate fuel pressure and flow. Over here we've started going through how the pinout and things are going to change from the old unit, EDM 800, to the new unit, EDM 930, which the 930 does a lot of things that the old 800 did not, primarily being fuel quantity and the fact that this is a primary instrument replacement for manifold pressure and RPM and basically all of the required engine instruments. This is a primary replacement, so we don't have to keep the old analog gauges. So that means we have to add a few things. It's not just a direct plug and play with the old unit. We'll have to add the lines from the fuel level sending units from the fuel tanks, which are already digital in this plane, which is nice. It had a digital indication before, so we just basically have to take the correct wires out and pin them into the connectors for the EDM unit. So that'll be fairly straightforward. What I was hoping actually came true, and EDM was nice enough to not change their pinout terribly from the older units to the newer units. So even though it looks considerably different on the back of here, what we actually have is 1, 2, 3, and 4 are also on the old one, which is 1, 2, 3, and this is actually 4 on the old one. So and then so the added one, pin 5 or jack 5, is actually the pigtailed one on the new unit.
So that's the one we have to wire.
This is the one we'll wire to the fuel level and the fuel pressure.
Oh, okay.
And here's how things went with the metalwork for the overlay panel.
last night I got so far as to start priming. So this was a finished unit, and I started priming it last night, let it dry overnight, and I actually dry fit it to the unit, and we weren't happy with the way it fit. We ended up with, by the time we got everything square and cleaned up, we ended up with a little bit bigger of a gap between the instrument bezel and the edge of the metal than we liked. So we're actually starting over and making a new one. So
aiming for perfection.
Aiming for perfection, hopefully.
Mike is installing the EGT and CHT probes on the left side of the engine this morning.
Well, I'm installing the exhaust gas temperature probes and labeling the wiring so that it can be used for diagnose problems later on.
Yeah, that'll be helpful.
So all the CHT and EGT will be labeled.
Okay.
And I have all the probes out, installing the last EGT and the last 2 CHTs.
Getting closer on take 2.
How does it feel to do this a second time?
Almost as much fun as the first time.
I usually find when I do something like this, the second time around it's even worse than the first time.
Yeah.
So
I would say that's a good assessment.
But in this case, the second attempt to cut the overlay panel turned out great.
Does this look better than the first one?
Oh yeah, much better. I'm much happier with this one. I think the first one I just got in a little bit of a hurry. Took too much material away at a time, and by the time I had it square and fitting properly, I had about a 1/16 of an inch gap all the way around, and I wasn't happy with that. So we did it again and it came out much better.
Gene is very happy with how it turned out, and I am too. He applies a primer and a couple of coats of paint. It looks amazing. It is day 4 of the installation. Gene is working on finishing up the wiring and the painting of the overlay panel.
Last night, after you left, I located the shunt for the ammeter and found that, and it was in good shape. I rang out the wires and figured out which wires come up to the panel for the ammeter. So I've got those written down on the wiring diagram so we can pin those. And then tonight we're going to ring out the rest of the wires from the old gauge cluster, because I don't have a pin out for that, so I've got to ring them out to figure out which ones are which so I can pin them into the new connectors.
Another thing yet to be installed is the new oil pressure sensor.
This pressure sensor was for the old EDM 800, which we'll replace with the new sensor. And then you also still had the traditional oil pressure line that actually runs all the way to your old oil pressure gauge. So we're completely removing the line to the gauge because you won't have a gauge anymore.
Right.
And then we're going to remove this T, and then the new pressure sensor will actually just plug right into the end of this cable, and we'll fasten it to your manifold here.
Okay.
So that'll kind of clean it up in here a little bit.
Yeah, and save a little weight.
Yeah.
All these hoses, gauges, it all adds up to
That's right.
quite a bit. That's the old tack cable.
That is the mechanical tack cable, yeah, and we're not going to use it again, and it's pretty old, so it doesn't really have any resale value, so rather than trying to fish it back through here, I'm going to cut it. I approved that with the owner before I did it.
And then the RPM in the future will come from the magneto, right?
Yeah, and it actually already did. You had RPM on your EDM 800, which will actually just replace the old sensor. It goes right in the same spot. There's 2 types of electronic tacks. There's that type that reads off of the gear, and then there's another type that actually connects to the P leads, and those are kind of nice because you can connect them to your ignition switch and not have to run any wires out. But,
All right, I've been gone for 3 days on work travel, but Gene and Mike, you guys have been busy. And
Yeah.
looking at the panel, it looks like huge progress. What did I miss?
So we're pretty much wrapped up. We finished up the wiring. We ended up using some existing wiring from the old EDM 800. What we couldn't use, we ran new. Mostly it was more convenient. If we were going to have to run a wire through the firewall anyway, it was more convenient to use the new stuff because it's already pinned into the connector with the factory wiring harness. So that helped a lot. Finished up the panel overlay. Got that all painted in nice and fitted. And finished pinning the connectors. And then we had a few more sensors left to put in when you left. We got those all wired up and connectors pinned, and we're ready for a power up, I think.
All right, I can't wait to see it in action.
Yeah,
Let's
me
give it
too.
a try.
All right, so just go ahead and hit the battery switch.
Oh, it's something.
I didn't want to pull the screen protector off. I don't know if you want me to or not.
Yeah, pull it off. That's fine.
Thought I would save that for you. Kind of a satisfying feel, maybe. And there it is.
And with that, the installation is complete. We are ready to start the engine and, if all looks good, go for a test flight. We'll do that in the next video. Until then, fly safe, please hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think about the new panel so far. See you soon!